Great to see everybody here this morning on a beautiful Labor Day weekend. What a beautiful day the Lord's given to us today to rejoice in and to enjoy. We finished our summer series last week, and the next 2 weeks I just want to bring a couple of single messages, because 2 weeks from now, Philip DeCourcy, our friend from Belfast originally, but who pastors in California now, he'll be with us, so I don't want to start a series and have to break the week. So we'll begin our next series on September 25th. But this morning I want to bring a message from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. If you'll turn there in your Bible with me, Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, a very familiar passage, I'm sure, to most of us. This is a great passage if you've never done so to memorize. It'd be wonderful this week to memorize these two verses. I've titled this message this morning, Run for Your Life. Let me read Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 for us. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God. May the Lord write his eternal word on our hearts this morning. One of the great stories that came out of this last summer Olympics in Rio is from a round one heat in the women's 5,000 meter race. That is a grueling race. It's 12 and a half times around the track. And about two-thirds of the way through the race, Nikki Hamblin, who's from New Zealand, and Abby D'Agostino from the U.S., found themselves crowded in with about 12 runners. And the feet of these two women got tangled up, and they both collapsed there on the track and went crashing down. And Abby D'Agostino, the American runner, she twisted her right knee badly, but she was the first to get up. And she put her hand on Hamblin's shoulder and said, get up, we have to finish this. And the New Zealand runner got up and said, yep, you're right, it's the Olympic Games. We have to finish this. Now, I like that story from the Olympics and the determination of these two ladies, because it's a picture really in many ways, or should be a picture, of every believer in Jesus Christ. According to the Bible, we are in a race. And this is the greatest, grandest race of all. You might call it the Masters Marathon, if you will. And if any of you have lived very long, you know that this race is not a sprint. It's not even 200 meters or 400 meters or 800 meters. It's a 5,000 meter or a marathon race. And every one of us here are in this long, grueling, exhausting, but also exhilarating race. And like those two runners, our attitude must be, we have to finish this. We have to stay in the race and finish for the glory of God. Now, in the New Testament, the Christian life is often pictured with the metaphor of an athletic race. And probably the best known of these is here in chapter 12 of the book of Hebrews. And I love these two verses because William Barclay, the great commentator, says Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 is a well-nigh perfect picture or perfect summary of the Christian life. It's a well-nigh perfect summary of the Christian life. So these verses picture the Christian life as a race from the beginning to the end. And I've got 5 points in your outline this morning I want to go through. We'll go through these quickly, but I want to start with the exhortation. That's the kind of the core of this passage. Everything around it kind of tells us how we do this. So we'll have the exhortation, then we want to look at the encouragement, the encumbrances, the example that God has given to us, and then the end of the race. Now we begin with the main exhortation in these verses, and it's right here in chapter 12, verse 1, and it's that phrase, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Again, everything else around that main idea just describes and defines for us how we do that. So this is the core thought for us. Now, just a little bit about the background of Hebrews, because we're kind of parachuting down near the end of this book, and it'll help us to understand the context of the book here. Hebrews was written in the early 60s AD probably to Jewish believers in the city of Rome. These are believers, Jewish people, Hebrew people who'd come to believe as Jesus as their Messiah. Probably this was before the outbreak of Nero's persecution in Rome. And the problem was, because of persecution of the believers, some of the people were being tempted to go back to Judaism. Judaism was kind of a safe haven at this time, and they were tempted to jettison Christ and to retreat or go back to Judaism. They were going to kind of flame out or fizzle out in their Christian lives. And so the theme of the book of Hebrews, if you're familiar with this book, is the supremacy of Jesus Christ. And starting in chapter 1 through chapter 10, the author here goes through and shows that Jesus is greater than angels, that He's greater than Moses, that He's greater than Aaron and the Aaronic priesthood, that He's a mediator of the new covenant, which is better than the old covenant, that His sacrifice is greater than the Old Testament sacrifices. You find the word better 13 times in the book of Hebrews. And so basically, the book of Hebrews is an author writing to an audience, basically saying, what in the world are you doing? What are you thinking? Why would you go back to the shadows when the sun has risen? So he's setting forth for them the supremacy of Jesus Christ, calling on them not to quit or to go back. And in the midst of this exhortation here, we come to Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, which is kind of like a dose of spiritual smelling salts, if you will, for these believers to help them and to help us get a second wind, if you will, in the race of life. And he calls on them to keep on running with endurance. To keep on running with endurance. That tells us, again, this is a long, grueling race. The word race here in the Greek language is the Greek word agona. We get our word agony from this word. And running a long race involves always a degree of agony and exhaustion. When someone tells me they want to run a marathon, I always ask them if they know where the word comes from. If you know anything about the original story, the Greeks were fighting the Persians down on the Greek shores, one of the great battles of ancient history on the plain of Marathon. The Greeks were victorious, and they sent a man named Phidippides to run back to Athens to tell of the victory. And Phidippides runs all the way back there, and when he gets there, he meets the leaders of Athens, and he gets out the words, "Hail, we are the winners." And then he collapsed and he died. So to me, I don't think it's God's will for anybody to run a marathon. I mean, the first guy died when he ran the thing, so why would I want to take up that race? I was reading a book by Joel Stoll this week, and he says this. He says, "I have nothing against runners. Some of my best friends are addicted runners. Though I have never seen a runner smiling, apparently there is something fulfilling about it." He says, "I even tried it once, waiting for that surge of ecstasy that my friends told me I would experience, only to find the ecstasy came when I stopped running." That's kind of been my experience with running as well. But what the Bible tells us is that all of us who know Jesus are in a spiritual marathon, and it's called an agona. I mean, there's a degree of agony and exhaustion that's involved in the Christian life. Certainly there is joy and there is exhilaration as well. But he's just being realistic about it here. And so he calls on each of us who are believers to run this race, this agona, and to run with endurance. And that word in the Greek, endure, literally means to remain under. Just to stay under it and just to keep going and to endure in the race of life. And he tells us that each of us are to run with endurance. Notice the race that is set before us. Every one of us here have our own race to run. We have a lane to run in, and our Lord Jesus has mapped out the race for us. But our races vary greatly. Every one of us here this morning have a different race to run. Kent Hughes, in his commentary on Hebrews, makes this statement. This is wonderful. Just ponder this for a moment. He says, "We each have a specific course mapped out for us, and the course for each runner is unique. Some are relatively straight, some are all turns. Some seem all uphill, some are a flat hiking path. All are long, but some are longer. But each of us can finish the race marked out for us. I may not be able to run your course, and you may find mine impossible, but I can finish my race, and you can finish yours. Have you ever noticed that in life? In fact, we're tempted sometimes to compare our race with somebody else's. Because we'll say, that guy over there or that lady, their race seems really straight, and mine's got a lot of twists and turns. Or, mine seems like it's uphill all the way. And theirs seems like it's a nice, flat, level path. First of all, I would caution us against comparison because none of us really know what's going on in the heart and life of another person. But sometimes I look at some people, even in the body of Christ, and I think, Lord, that person just seems like it's just a long slog uphill for that person. Their race seems so difficult. But we all have a race, whatever it is. And the Lord is saying, look, I've mapped out a race for you. It's an agona. It involves some agony and exhaustion, but I want you to run this race, and I want you to run it with endurance. Stay under it. Now, to help us in the race, God gives us encouragement. Now, let's go back to the beginning of verse 1, and He says, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us. Now, it starts with the word therefore, which is a transition word that obviously is reaching back to the preceding context. And the preceding context of chapter 11 is all of these Old Testament saints who've gone before us. And he's saying, therefore, since we have this great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, and this picture is kind of a capacity crowd at a stadium. Something electrifying, like a wave of enthusiasm. There's nothing like a college football stadium for electricity and enthusiasm on a Saturday afternoon or Saturday evening. We all kind of saw that as the season kicked off yesterday. And he pictures this great cloud of witnesses like in a stadium. Now, when I was growing up, the way I always heard this explained and the way I pictured it is, we're down there on the field, on the playing field, and this great cloud of witnesses are like in the stadium, and they're the spectators, and they're watching us down there on the field, and they're cheering us on. But I think it's actually the opposite. It's not them watching us, but it's us watching them. In other words, they're a great cloud of witnesses who've lived before us, who are witnessing to us and testifying to us of a life lived by faith and how we can make it to the end of the race without quitting, even in the spite of difficult circumstances. So they bear witness to us that God can see us through to the end. I mean, Enoch and Abraham and Sarah and Jacob and Samson and Rahab and David and Daniel, this great Westminster Abbey of faith, as it's often called here in chapter 11. But the lives of these Old Testament saints are a motivation and an incentive to us not to go back. And that's the whole point. That's why Hebrews 11 is in this book, because these Jewish Christians are tempted to go back to Judaism. They say, look at all these in the Old Testament and all they suffered and what they had to endure. They didn't quit. They didn't go back. You follow their example. That's one of the reasons it's good to read the Old Testament and read about the great men and women of faith. It's one of the reasons why periodically in the church we do a biographical study of an Old Testament character. We've done Gideon here and Elijah, and Wednesday nights we've done the life of Solomon, to see what happened in the lives of these Old Testament believers, because they are there to give us encouragement. They stayed in the race and they finished, and so can we. So the exhortations, run the race with endurance. The encouragement, look to these witnesses. But another thing we have to do is eliminate the encumbrances. Let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. So we move from the stands now, if you will, down to the track, getting ready for the race. And when runners get ready for the race, they do everything they can to eliminate drag. And he says, let's lay aside every encumbrance. Now that word in the Greek is the word onkos, and I mention that because we get our medical term oncology from that. Those physicians who treat cancer and tumors. Because actually the Greek word onkos literally means a mass or a tumor. But it came to just kind of mean any kind of a weight. So he's saying here we need to lay aside all the masses, if you will, or the weights that entangle us. And runners get rid of everything that will hold them back. One of the things they get rid of is excess body weight. You'll never see a chubby marathon runner, right? Or at least not one at the finish line. I mean, one of my friends used to say that those marathon runners are just lungs on a stick, is all they are. I mean, that's kind of what they look like as they go along there. But they get rid of excess clothing, that they take off the sweatpants and the ankle weights and anything that will slow or impede their progress. Now, it's important to notice these encumbrances here are not sinful things, because that's distinguished in the next phrase when he says, lay aside every encumbrance and the sin that so easily entangles us. So what these encumbrances are is they're things that aren't sinful, but that can delay us and distract us in the Christian life. These are things that sap our energy, they divert our attention, they dampen our enthusiasm about the things of God, and they dull our competitive edge. In other words, they're not sinful in themselves, which tells us something may be something that's not sinful, but it's still not right for us or good for us in our lives. So a good thing can become a bad thing if it slows us down and impedes our progress. Now, what are some things in our lives that are encumbrances that can weigh us down? Let me just mention a few. By the way, let me just say this. One of the assignments this morning is I want everybody here to think of an encumbrance in your life that you need to put aside. Everybody's got one. And there probably is one that will come to mind pretty quickly. One I can think of immediately is too much recreation and entertainment. Recreation and entertainment are not bad in and of themselves. All of us need a relief in life. We can't be serious and work all the time. It's a good relief that God has given to us. But for some people, recreation and entertainment becomes the focus of life. And it's an encumbrance that holds them back. Some people, it's their career. It's good to work hard and to honor God and our work. But again, too much ambition and too much focus on career can be an encumbrance. Maybe some habit that you have. It's not a sinful thing, but it's a habit you have and it's holding you back. Maybe a hobby that you have, or maybe it's sports. I mean, we're a sports-mad culture. Maybe it's a relationship, or it's lack of discipline in your life, or procrastination, or whatever it is. These things vary from person to person. But every one of us here, if we're honest, would probably say in our own mind, there is this thing in my life over here that it's not a bad thing, it's not sinful, but it dominates my life in such a way that it really is holding me back and impeding my progress. Maybe something you have to get rid of altogether, or something you need to just pull back into moderation in your life. But we need to think about what those are and put them aside. Then he moves from what encumbers us to what entangles us. And he says, and the sin which so easily entangles us. Now, when he says there, and in the original there, that there's a definite article, it's the sin which so easily entangles us. Because of that, many believe the sin here is the sin of lack of faith or doubt. Because obviously the previous chapter is the great faith chapter in the Bible. You have the words by faith 21 times in that chapter. So many believe when he says the sin, with what he's just been talking about, he's talking about lack of faith or doubt. And that's the sin that easily entangles us. And certainly, lack of faith and doubt is something we all struggle with at times. But I think when he says the sin that entangles us, he's looking at a particular sin maybe that each person has. When I was younger, they used to call this your besetting sin. Because the old King James says, the sin that so easily besets us. But every one of us, if we're honest, we could sit here right now, I bet, and we could say, those one or two things are the entangling, ensnaring, besetting sins in my life. One translation has for this, the sin which clings so closely to us. We each have sins, certain sins that cling closely to us. And it's not the same for all of us. And sometime, I'll look at somebody who's got a particular sin problem in their life, and you think, why in the world can't they overcome that? Well, it's not something I'm really tempted that much to do. It's not something I struggle with. But for them, it is a besetting sin. It clings closely to them. We might think of sins like pride, or greed, or lust, sexual immorality, worry, gossip, laziness, jealousy, impatience, addiction. Many people struggle with some addiction. It's just hard for them to overcome. Anger, self-pity, ingratitude, hatred, bitterness, unforgiveness, a critical spirit. If I haven't hit yours, I can keep going on if you all want me to do that, but probably hit some of us here already in some of this list, right? Every one of us here would say, there is a sin or two, and maybe more than that, but probably at least mainly one or two that cling closely to me. And I can tell you, I know what they are in my life very well, and I can tell you I hate them. I hate those things. And you need to know what it is, though, because I've met people before that I've been around them and I've gotten to know them well, and it's obvious to me what their problem is, and it's obvious to everybody else, but they're oblivious to it. It's like they don't know. And the first step in this is to be honest with God and to know what our weaknesses are and what our entangling sins are and to face them and admit them. That's where it begins. And then to go and seek the Lord about it and to pray for His help and His strength every day. And to avail yourself of the means of grace. Read your Bible and pray and come and be with God's people on Sundays. A fellowship with the Lord's people so that they can help you and bring encouragement in your life. Look, to run effectively, we have to lay aside the encumbrances. And we have to lay aside the entangling sins that hold us back. Now, to finish the race, we also need an example. You'll notice chapter 12, verse 2, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. Now, a lot of translations here will say, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. But the word our is not there. He's the author, and that word means the pioneer or the leader. Jesus is the pioneer or the trailblazer of faith, and He is the finisher or the completer of faith. And it's saying in this race, we need to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. Now, He's given us all the Old Testament saints in chapter 11 who are a great model for us. But what He's saying here is, Jesus is the embodiment of trust in God. He is the preeminent example and model of faith. And we look to Jesus and we see in Jesus the one who models for us how to live the life of faith and how to finish the race. And notice it says about Jesus that He is the author and perfecter of faith, He who endured the cross. And literally you could translate this, disregarding the shame. He disregarded the shame and the humiliation. And He endured the cross. In other words, He is the consummate example of one who lived by faith, who lived for God and who finished the race and who finished it perfectly. But I like this because Jesus isn't just our example, He's also our enabler. I don't know about you, but sometimes someone who's an example is wonderful and they can be inspiring, but they can also be discouraging and frustrating. For instance, if you're a golfer and you go out and play with someone who's really, really, really good, I mean, it's just great at striking the ball, it can be inspiring to watch them hit it well, but it can also be discouraging and frustrating because you're never going to hit it that well. So I love this. Jesus isn't just an example because we could look to Him and say, well, that's wonderful that Jesus lived that way, but He's the Son of God and I can't meet up to that. He's also the one who enables us to do it. He's the completer. He's the finisher of faith. So He's the pioneer, the leader that shows us how this life is to be lived and how this race is to be run. But He's also the one who comes along and gives us the power to do it. He's the pioneer that shows the way, but He's the power that energizes us to make it to the finish line and win. About a week ago, Cheryl and I went and saw the new movie Ben-Hur. And most of you know that the original was made in 1959. Cecil B. DeMille made the movie, and Charlton Heston was the lead actor playing the part of Judah Ben-Hur. And of course, the important part of the movie, the great part of it, is the great chariot race at the end. And to make it as authentic as it could be, Cecil B. DeMille wanted Charlton Heston to not use a stunt double and to go and actually learn how to drive one of these chariots. And so Heston agreed it would make the movie more authentic. So he went and took chariot driving lessons. I don't know where you do that, but anyway, they found somebody. And I guess, driving a chariot with 4 horses abreast is not the easiest thing to do. So he was at it for some time, extensive work and some weeks of practice before they began filming the movie. And when he came back to report to the director, he said, "I think I can drive the chariot all right, Cecil, but I'm not at all sure I can actually win the race." And smiling slightly, DeMille said to him, "Heston, you just stay in the race and I'll make sure you win." That's the advantage of being the director, right? But to me, that's a great illustration of the spiritual race that we're running as Christians. Jesus says to us the same thing that Cecil B. DeMille said to Charlton Heston. You just stay in the race, and I'll make sure you win. I will empower you, and I will energize you, and I'll enable you to win the race. Jesus is the author, and He is the perfecter of faith. Now, the final point of every race is the end. It's the finish line. It's the giving of the awards. And this last phrase here says, Jesus, for the joy set before Him, He endured the cross, despising the shame, and He sat down at the right hand of God. All races, all competitive races end with rewards. Now, there's an award ceremony. It was true back in the Greek times, the Roman times. It's still true today. And here's something in this passage that I had never thought of before. And this is the joy and the beauty of studying the Bible. You're constantly learning things, constantly seeing things you've never seen before. I mean, it's the joy of discovery. I had never thought about this before in this way. Jesus endured the cross because of the joy set before Him, because of the reward. Now, certainly Jesus endured the cross to save us, and He loves us, and that was part of it. But I'd never thought of the fact that the thing that motivated Jesus was the reward at the end of the race. And what was His reward? The joy of exaltation. The joy of being seated at the right hand of the Father and glorifying Him. Jesus looked for the reward. Even Jesus looked for the reward, which was His exaltation and glory. And I love that it says, for the joy set before Him, the joy of being seated at God's right hand, He disregarded the shame. He endured the cross. He sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. It was what was at the end of the race that motivated Jesus, the joy of exaltation. Now, a lot of people kind of don't like this idea. It bothers them that God is a rewarder. And I've actually known people that think, I don't think God's going to give us any rewards. Everybody's just the same in heaven. Well, look back at Hebrews 11:6. This is a great verse, just in the previous chapter. It says, without faith it is impossible to please God, for the one who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who seek Him. You come to God, you need to believe two things. You believe God is, and you believe that God is a rewarder of those who seek Him. That if we seek Him, we trust in Him, that God is a rewarder. Look down at verse 24, chapter 11. By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. The thing that caused Moses to put aside the treasures of Egypt and take his place with the people of God was the reward that he knew he would receive in the future. The Apostle Paul, when he was writing in one of his letters near the end of his life, Philippians 2, says, I press on toward the goal for the prize at the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Paul was looking for the prize. So God is a rewarder. And the end of the race holds a reward for those who run it faithfully. So we have here in Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, a summary of the Christian life. We run this race with endurance. The faithful saints are behind us, testifying to us and witnessing to us how to run it. We have encumbrances and entanglements around us that we need to get rid of. We have Jesus out before us who is our example and who's our enabler. We have the rewards ahead of us at the finish line. Now, it may be that there's someone here this morning and you've never entered the race. You can't run the race if you've never entered it. And you enter the race of the Christian life by putting your faith and your trust in Jesus Christ. Just a few chapters earlier in Hebrews 7:25, it says that Jesus is able to save forever those who draw near to God through Him. I like the way the old King James says it. It says, He saves to the uttermost those who come to God through Him. So if you've never trusted Christ, if you'll come to Him this morning, He will save you to the uttermost. He will save you forever. The one who died and rose again on your behalf. Why not look to Him and trust Him this morning to be your Savior from sin? Some of you here this morning are early in the race. We have young people here in our church. We have a lot of young couples and young parents. I would urge you at this point in your life to get serious and set the pace for your family early. Time goes quickly. And throw off the encumbrances and the entanglements. Look, we'll never be perfect in this life, but the earlier you begin to deal with the encumbrances and the entanglements in your life, the easier it will be to overcome them throughout your life, because old habits are hard to break. And your life will get in like wagon wheels in a rut. And it's never easier to throw off these encumbrances and entanglements than it is when you're younger. And get serious about your life as a Christian. You only get one shot at this race. There aren't any do-overs. There's no practice runs. And there are a lot of people later in life who look back and would love to change things earlier in their life. And if you're a young person or a young couple or young parents, you have this before you now, and you have the opportunity to run the race with endurance, throwing off these entanglements and these encumbrances. Some of us are a little further in the race. We may be in the middle of the race or maybe a little bit beyond. They say in a marathon about the 20 or 21 mile point, a lot of times people hit the wall, they call it. You may be in that phase of life where you're struggling with issues with your children, or maybe with parents who are ailing, or whatever it may be, and you may be hitting the wall and wondering if you can keep going. My encouragement to you this morning would be to fix your eyes on Jesus and look to Him to give you His grace and His strength to finish the race. And there's some of you here that may be approaching the finish line. The finish line's kind of coming into sight out there, maybe for the first time in your life. Now, certainly none of us here know how long we're going to live, but you reach a certain point in life, and I won't define it for us here this morning, but somewhere in life you begin to see the finish line in view. And I would encourage those of you that are in that place in the race of life not to give up, but to finish strong, to finish well. I talk to younger people sometimes, and they say, I can't wait till I get older, how much easier life's going to get. Well, you look at people when they're older, it's not that easy a lot of times. In fact, sometimes making it to the finish line can be very, very difficult. It's interesting how God works in His providence. I was in my office Thursday afternoon studying this passage, and I was thinking about this exact point, about the end, about reaching the end of life, and how important it is to finish strong. And the phone rang, and it was a man who'd called me the day before, and he didn't leave a message, just said he would call back. And he called again. I thought that's kind of odd that he's calling 2 days in a row. It's a man named Steve Druskin. Steve went to our church for several years. He and his wife Sandy moved out to California, been there for several years. And Steve emails me a lot, but he's never called me on the phone. And he emails me all the time. I mean, Steve, I've got to say, he's one of the most encouraging guys that's ever been in my ministry. I mean, he emails me almost every week or two, not anything long, but just he's always listening to the sermons out there in California. I mean, the guy almost embarrasses me the way he goes on. And anyway, he's just been a tremendous encouragement to me. And he was telling me that I'm going to be speaking at a place in a month in Minnesota, and he was planning to come and see me there because he was going to be in that area. Because he comes a lot of times, and I've been in California out there, and he'll come and hear me. And he told me, he said, but I'm not going to be able to come. He said, the cancer that I had, and he had cancer a year or so ago, a couple of years, didn't seem that serious. And anyway, it's spread, and he told me that it's in his lungs, and it's in his liver, and there's nothing they can do for him. He has about 2 to 3 months to live. And some of you may remember Steve and his dear wife, Sandy, as they were here. Anyway, he just called me, and he was, had obviously emotion in his voice. He just told me how much he loved me and cared about me, and he told me this probably the last time. He said, probably the last time I'll ever talk to you. So anyway, I gave him my cell number, and I said, don't make it the last time we talk. You call me some, and we'll talk again. And been praying for him every day during this time. But I hung up the phone, and we talked quite a while. Hung up the phone there, wept in my office. I mean, just thinking about what he's going to endure the next 2 to 3 months. But also excited for him because he knows the Lord. But thinking about his wife, Sandy, and her missing him, losing him. But it's something he said was beautiful. He said, Mark, he said, I'm reading Randy Alcorn's book, Heaven. And he says, I'm reading that book more carefully than I ever have before. He goes, that book is my travel brochure now of where I'm going. But I've talked to Cheryl a lot about that, my wife, since then, because I've said, what would that be like? To know you've got 60 or 90 days. You're not going to be here on this earth past Thanksgiving. Now, again, none of us know how long we're going to be here, but to have that out there, that's where he is in his life. He's at the finish line, but he's finishing well. And I'm praying for him every day that he will continue in that. After the conversation with him, I thought of an article by Robertson McQuilkin. Some of you may know his name. He was the president of Columbia Bible College and Seminary. And he's well known because at the peak of his time of success, his wife Muriel contracted Alzheimer's. And he quit all of that and went home to stay with her to take care of her. And he wrote a book called Promise Kept. And someone asked him, well, when did you make the decision to leave your work and to go home and take care of your wife? And he said, I made it back when I stood at the altar when we got married and promised her I'd be faithful in sickness and in health. So something that had been there throughout his whole life. But Robertson McQuilkin, he died a few years ago at age 88, but he wrote a little article called Let Me Get Home Before Dark. And I thought for some of you maybe who are getting nearer to the finish line, this might be an encouragement to you. Let me read what McQuilkin said, just a little couple sentences from it. He says, it's sundown, Lord. The shadows of my life stretch back into the dimness of the years long spent. I fear not death, for that grim foe betrays himself at last, thrusting me forever into life with you, unsoiled and free. But I fear the dark specter may come too soon, or do I mean too late? I fear that before I finish, I might stain your honor, shame your name, grieve your loving heart. Few, they tell me, finish well. Lord, let me get home before dark. Look, for every one of us here, we want to make sure that we don't end before we finish. We don't want to leave this world with days and months and maybe even years unredeemed and not given over to the Lord and running with endurance the race set before us. We want to end and we want to finish at the same time. And we want to finish well. Let's pray together.